Thank you, Gwyn, and they're absolutely red hot on the badges that Gwyn touched on. I've had a couple of "Oi, who are you, where are you going" this morning, so please make sure you wear your badges at all times. It's something to do with photography and having the right pictures without a green thing around my neck. Look, I think we know from what's going on outside the reason for the extra security this year. It is great to see so many old, familiar faces here today, but it's also, as Gwyn said, great to have all those next generation farmers as well with us. But actually, when you consider the noise outside, the drums that are being beaten, that's why we're wearing badges, that's why we're having to have extra security. And I really would like to start by thanking Karen Spellman, Secretary of State, and Jim Pace for running the gauntlet of those protesters to show their support for our industry on this really important issue for us. When we met last year, nobody could have predicted the roller coaster of a year we've just experienced. The tsunami in Japan, the end of nuclear power announced in Germany, riots on our streets here in England, the whole European project thrown into doubt. And then when you see the press again today, Iran, who knows where that will ultimately end. PricewaterhouseCoopers have coined a phrase. They now talk about rolling uncertainty in relation to the whole euro crisis. And again, those of you who have seen the television this morning will have seen potentially an upturn in that uncertainty until we have another set of bad news. Actually, I think rolling uncertainty sums up how things are across the board for all of us as farmers. The arrival of Schmallenberg and what that might mean for livestock farmers is just the latest example of uncertainty. Last year, I talked about how agriculture needed to be moved up the policy agenda. And I do think, with all those competing crises, that rolling uncertainty, agriculture is now getting some serious attention from policymakers across the board. We've had the first ever G20 agriculture meeting in Paris last June, and the result was an action plan on food price volatility and agriculture. Last month, we had the UN Secretary General's high-level report into global sustainability. It had agricultural productivity right at its heart. Just a couple of weeks ago, The Economist held its first international summit called Feeding the 9 Billion. I don't know how many of you are like me who listen when you can to the Today programme. You heard Bill Gates last month on that programme. Agriculture was the main theme in this year's Gates Foundation annual letter. And I was particularly struck by what Gates said, and when someone like Bill Gates said it, people sit up and listen. He said, and he talked about the lost decade when we stepped back from agricultural research, and how we're now paying the price for having done that. These reports are all signs, these reports and events are all signs the policymakers are beginning to recognise the potential of agriculture to meet these big challenges we all face in the 21st century. So, why do I still feel frustrated? Because, as Norman Borlaug, the father of the 20th century's Green Revolution, said when he looked at wheat varieties he was working on in the lab, the potential is there. But you can't eat potential. Commissioner, Secretary of State, Minister of Agriculture, let me say where I think British agriculture is at this moment in time. Our overriding priority is to realise that potential, and by that I mean growth, which is generally sustainable now and into the future. The now is really important because we know with the state of the economy, the food and farming industry with its £100 billion input can really help kickstart our economic recovery. And we need growth as far as we can see into the future to provide us with long-term food security in that increasingly uncertain world that I've already referred to. Achieving that growth is first and foremost a challenge for us, farmers and growers, those of us in this room. But it is also a huge challenge for the industry's scientists. They will tell us proudly that the potential yield for wheat is 19 tonnes per hectare. And really worryingly, we're averaging less than half that right now. We've got to move quickly to make up that ground, and that's true for all sectors across the board in agriculture. And in many areas, Secretary of State, you are helping us as a government move in the right direction. You've taken that tough decision to go ahead with the badger culls in 2 pilot areas, part of your commitment to eradicate bovine TB. And you've done that in the face of considerable opposition. Again, refer you to the events this morning. I'd like to pay tribute again to you and Jim for putting yourselves on the line, and also the efforts of all the people behind the scenes who have put so much work in on the ground. And it's, to me, a really good example of the NFU working well as an organisation, professionals and farmers at a local level who have organised those pilot culls. A big thank you to all of those. I'd also like to commend the government on the work it's doing in unblocking the planning system as well. For all the farmers I meet to as I travel around, getting planning permission, getting planning consent is probably the single most frustrating process farmers experience. Whether it's state-of-the-art polytunnels, on-farm vegetable packhouses, high welfare animal housing, anaerobic digestions, all these hallmarks of our future and smart farming. I really do urge the government to stick to its guns on the planning issue. I know it sparked significant opposition from conservation groups, but as the Prime Minister has often said, the countryside cannot be allowed, the countryside must be allowed to grow and prosper. It can't be left to fossilise. We live there. It's where I raise and play with my children. Trust us on that. I'd also like to mention DEFRA's new exports action plan. What I really appreciate about this is the explicit recognition that farming can make a positive economic contribution to the UK's trade balance, and I welcome the start that DEFRA, the Business Department, and the Devolves have made in this area. And while we're on the positives, I'd like to say a few words about solar power. I'm not suggesting the government has covered itself in glory in the way it's managed the feed-in tariffs. I think we all know that has not been the case. But a happy combination of the market, the obvious benefits of the technology, and the financial incentives has led to a massive uptake of solar power on Britain's farms. According to a recent survey we carried out, 1 in 6 farmers by this summer will be generating electricity from solar power. I'm pleased to see the government has really ambitious plans. It wants 22 gigawatts of PV by 2020. That's a huge amount. About 2/3 of the output of Drax, the biggest single power station in the UK. And we believe that a significant chunk of that should come from our farms. That's all positive. They are the kind of policies that we must pursue relentlessly if we're going to meet the massive challenge set by last year's Foresight report. Add to that the messages that I've mentioned earlier that are coming from the G20 and the UN. We must take it all seriously, and it means that all government policy across all departments in all countries must be looked at through the food security lens. That's how serious this is. And it's the only way we have a cat in hell's chance of feeding ourselves and, of course, playing a part in feeding the rest of the world in 2050. But actually, Secretary of State, and this is the bit where I have to be honest, across government, the delivery isn't always matching the rhetoric and the challenge. At Oxford in January, you talked about the Water White Paper and the fact it encourages the use of on-farm reservoirs. We all agree water storage in water-stressed areas is a no-brainer. Just look at the coverage we've seen over yesterday about the drought and even again this morning on the television. In terms of policy signals that match your and DEFRA's call, what's coming out of the Treasury on farm reservoirs is woeful. Businesses used to be eligible for tax relief if they built reservoirs. They no longer are. What kind of message does that really send to a vegetable producer who's got to reduce his summer abstraction? I've got a similar message on the groceries adjudicator. It's 2 years now since the code was introduced, and we still don't have any monitoring or enforcement. In the meantime, I continue to hear about suppliers, particularly in fresh produce, being squeezed by supermarkets in a way which, if it was brought to light, would really shock consumers. We've got a cross-party agreement on the need for adjudicator. We have a draft bill. We've had 2 parliamentary committees look at it and make strong recommendations. So what's the problem? I'll tell you where I believe the problem is. I believe the retailers are all over Number 10 and the business department arguing that an adjudicator is anti-business. I heard Justin King do just that at the City Food Lecture last week. What I say is not having an adjudicator is anti-business. We urgently need you to see the bill passed into law and allow the adjudicator to act on evidence submitted by third parties like the NFU. And when I'm talking about measures that support business, I have to say that we're desperately disappointed by the lack of compulsory contract rules across member states in the EU dairy package that has been agreed. Perhaps, Commissioner, you might touch on that when you speak in a few moments. I also want to mention the Regulation Task Force. I'm really glad, Jim, that you've set up the implementation group under Richard McDonald to see that work through. Yes, there's some good stuff happening. The changes in the frequency of hygiene inspections on dairy farms who are in assurance schemes is a good example. And applying the principle of earned recognition in other areas, like NVZ record keeping on organic farms and low-intensity farms, is good as well. But it's not enough. Ministers, please be bold, more bold. Please resist the temptation as well to burden us further. Because if you're championing pragmatic, smart, cost-sensitive approach to regulation, I cannot for the life of me understand why DEFRA is proposing to remove the exemption from SAFO regulation for pre-1991 silage, slurry and fuel stores. I'd be more sympathetic if I could see a rise in pollution incidents from older stores, but we're not. It's just a proposal without a purpose. Before I move on to talk about the future of the CAP, I'd like to say something about farming and the environment. It wouldn't be right for me to stand here and cherry-pick from John Bennington's Foresight report just the bits that talk about increasing agricultural productivity. The report makes it clear that the way we've been farming has to change. If it doesn't, we'll damage our own capacity to produce food in the future. We have to be ambitious for the environment, and particularly when it comes to the protection of our primary resources, water, soils, and air. It's right, we aim high. And I'm really proud of what farmers have achieved over the last 20 years. Rivers in England and Wales are at their healthiest in over a century. Otters returning and salmon returning in record numbers across the country. The industry-led campaign for the farmed environment is delivering in England. 96% of the growth in in-field ELS options has been in counties specifically targeted by the CFE. And there's plenty of good news. I'd love to spend the whole morning bragging about the farming industry's record. But what it does show is that it is possible to balance our environmental ambitions with our core role as producers. To come back to that UN high-level report I mentioned at the start, this is how the panel put it, and I've got a slide to just lay out in clear detail what the panel said. Governments and international organizations should work to create a new green revolution, an evergreen revolution for the 21st century that aims to at least double productivity while drastically reducing resource use and avoiding further loss of biodiversity, topsoil loss, water depletion, and contamination. And it says we have to do all this by scaling up investment in agricultural research and development to ensure that cutting-edge research is rapidly moved from the laboratory to the field. So that does bring me to the future of the CAP. The CAP has delivered in the 50th year of the CAP. It has certainly delivered for Europe in the past. But now it has to deliver again, this time against a new set of constraints and challenges. Commissioner, let me commend you on 4 particular elements of last October's proposals. First, the vision of food security through greater competitiveness, of sustainable management of natural resources, of commonality and simplification. We wholeheartedly agree with those goals. Secondly, the focus on research and development. This fits completely with Bill Gates' vision of what the UN panel has also said. It has real potential to get some innovative solutions again out to the field from the lab. Thirdly, for genuinely in your attempt to unblock the rural development package so that it's no longer divided into rigid axes. That will make it easier to get real value from the second pillar. And lastly, of your proposals, your desire to strengthen farmers' position in the supply chain. We commend that too. But for everyone in the room would know that we also have some very serious reservations about your proposals. If I have to sum them up, I'd say that you set the compass with your vision in the right direction, but then you've set off on a different road to somewhere else. If you pursue your plan for a fixed 7% of land out of production, it will inevitably damage the productivity and competitiveness of Europe's farms. If you force farmers to maintain permanent pasture regardless of its environmental quality, it won't just add complexity, it could lead to environmentally counterproductive consequences. I know you've worked hard to get the support of your colleagues on the budget in DG Environment and DG Climate Change, so they support the CAP budget allocation. Commissioner, to be honest, I'm actually less afraid of across-the-board budget reductions than I am of across-the-board damage to our competitiveness as farmers. But we do generally want to move forward with you on this. I hope we can convince you to drop some of the more restrictive proposals and keep the ones that will take us in the direction of your overarching vision. So please, let's keep talking and finding a way to improve what's on the table. And now to the Secretary of State and DEFRA. Secretary of State, you're obviously the responsible minister in this area. You've stressed that you are looking for a reform that will provide the best deal for farmers, consumers, and the environment. So, I've got another slide to put up to show the allocation across Europe. This slide shows where progress can be made. It shows the average cap payments per hectare for our main competitors. You might have better read them all. It starts Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, Ireland, EU15, France, England, and Wales. It's the poultry allocation of the rural development funding in red that really stands out. And the fact that we're the only member state that has voluntary modulation highlighted in green to make up some of the shortfall and fund the targeted environmental schemes we have. Secretary of State, when the Commissioner's proposals were published, you made it clear that you shared our frustration and wanted to see a fairer share of rural development funding. We know you're under pressure from other parts of government, and we know you're one of the few European ministers who holds both the environmental brief as well as the farming one. But as I look at that graph, I have to say we're depending on you because your predecessors have form when it comes to the CAP. In 2003, Margaret Beckett signed up to a deal which resulted in as many variations of the single payment scheme as there were member states. It was so complex that nobody could work out whether there was a level playing field, let alone to begin to unravel the distortions. Mrs. Beckett then introduced a flat rate system that saw, in England, an additional 40,000 new claimants pilot. It brought the RPA to its knees, and we know we were the laughingstock of Europe. In 2008, Hilary Benn went over to negotiate the CAP health check. I remember seeing the coverage of other ministers going back and bragging about what they'd done for their farmers. What did Hilary Benn bring back for farmers in England? The son of set-aside. It took us working with the CLA and others, and I'm great to see Harry Cottrell at his first NFU conference. It took an awful lot of time to convince him not to legislate, but to trust us with the campaign for the farmed environment. Secretary of State, I know you're a really positive participant around the negotiating table in Brussels. Please don't come back with an agreement that paves the way for England or indeed Wales to choose to unilaterally reduce direct payments for our farmers. And don't bring back the flexibility to impose even deeper greening here than other member states are looking for. What I would say is do come back with news that you've secured a more level playing field for us. The competitiveness of farmers in England and Wales has been strengthened, not compromised. In other words, come back with a result that chimes with your own ambition to see us producing more and selling more in international markets where we compete with exactly those countries that lead us in those payment charts: the Dutch, the Danish, the Germans, the French. And if I could go back one last time to the Commissioner, I have one last ask for you. You have a hugely important role in making sure the Common Agricultural Policy is just that it's common. And if it's not identical in each member state, and I understand the politics of 27, it must have rules that are at least equivalent. Please make sure the member states don't disadvantage their own farmers. In closing, let me be clear. Farmers really appreciate it when political leaders talk up agriculture and how it can deliver this enormous sustainable food production energy challenge we face. I congratulate you both on what you've achieved so far in what are incredibly challenging times. And we look forward to working with you both to make sure that we don't just talk about the challenges, and this is the key for me over this conference, is how we get on and deliver. As Gwyn said earlier, we have a massive contingent of positive, optimistic young farmers with us this year. That's vital, because it's the next generation will be running our farms and getting involved in the NFU as these big challenges play out. The next 2 days conference is how we start to deliver on the big challenges. Thank you very much.